I want to be part of it. So that's great too. And it was an inspirational and fun video. So that's the big news of last week. The other thing to know is that we are hosting another webinar on June 8th, and it's going to focus on conservation easements. As you know, if you were working with Green Info Network, you know, that's the space that's it's harder to classify, right? Because each easement is its own beast. And so we're going to try to showcase some examples of sort of different flavors of conservation easements that are consistent with our definition. We're actually going to have Green Info Network give an update of what they're working on. So that should be a good webinar. That's on June 8th from 10:30 to 12. And if you are looking at me like, I don't know what any of this is, then that means you need to get on our mailing list, because we don't send a lot of mail, but when we do, we tell you what's up. We have a newsletter that comes out roughly every 2 months. We'll tell you about our upcoming webinars and, of course, share our progress report. So if you haven't signed up for my listserv, I want you to do it right now. I'll put it in the chat how you can do that. And then lastly, just an update on the budget. I don't know what day today is. Was it last week, week before? The governor rolled out the May revised proposal. So now everyone's sort of deep into hearings and conversations around the budget. I think the most important takeaway for the nature-based solutions set aside is that there were actually no new cuts to that line item proposed, which again is a testament to your support for conservation and advocacy and letting people know how important that is to you. So all the same cuts that were proposed or solutions in January, no new ones have been added. And in fact, some restoration dollars were actually proposed for restoration for floodplain work in the Central Valley, not surprisingly, after all the floods. So of course, you know, any of you know, this is it's a process. They're in conversation now. So that's underway where that will all land. But I think you should take heart that the governor retained a lot of support for the programs that support the work that we do in 30 by 30. And then the last piece is to just be aware that, you know, there is, you know, discussion about a bond. There are proposals on the table already through the legislature. The governor will be unveiling his sort of vision for how that will look in coming days, hopefully soon. And so I think keep an eye out for that. Hopefully once it's out, we can have another conversation maybe about what that looks like, but then that will be its own long negotiation with the legislature on what that package will entail. But I think you can feel confident that 30 by 30 investments will be showcased because we have a good strategy. We've got good partners. So why wouldn't it be? With that, I'm happy to answer questions or pass the baton to someone else.
Jen, thank you so much.
Sure.
These updates are really so helpful to all of us, I know. Does anybody have any questions for Jen? And Kyla, do you want to handle weeding that out?
Yeah, I don't see anyone on the chat.
Seriously, Tasha?
Tasha,
that one.
I do have a question. So yeah. You mentioned the bonds and that the governor might have his proposal out any day now. Do you know if the governor is going to propose anything along the same lines as what the legislature is doing in terms of amount? Because one, that's a big question, is how much the governor is willing to, how high he's willing to go.
Yeah, I can confidently say I have no idea. I've heard a lot of numbers and there's a lot in the atmosphere. And I think we'll all find out together. Maybe
Okay.
a couple hours before you.
Yeah.
I think we don't know at this point. Nope.
That's the big question that everyone's kind of like, you know, fumbling around right now.
Yeah. And then which ballot it would go on. I think that's the other question that I've heard is kind of live too. So
definitely.
Walter.
Can you talk a little bit about and give a little more color commentary to the work you're doing on the data gathering with Green Info?
Oh, sure. I thought that you all were part of a workshop. Am I making that up? Okay. So we had funding in last year's in the nature-based solutions set aside to fund Green Info Network to do sort of a couple of things. Like one, just help us get better data in general in our system, but also to develop what they're sort of calling as a toolkit, almost like a decision tree for how you figure out where you classify your information and how to get that in. And so as part of that, and Madeline knows this in more detail than I do, I'll confess, but part of that was they did some sort of deep dives with different sectors. So the land trust community, I think you had a workshop. I think they're talking to CAL FIRE. I forget what the other one is, but it's sort of like places where lands are a little more gray and there's a little more, but there's a lot of potential. They don't want to have to review each one individually. I will tell you, for the year before this, people would just email me and be like, add my property. That's not a good system. We want to have like categorically, all this is in, categorically, that's all out, and here's how you solve for the middle. So that's what Green Info Network is helping us do. And so part of that work is ongoing, but also just the visibility of 30 by 30 this past year. More people sent in properties that hadn't been counted. So they're going to hopefully get more stuff in the system that just is just missing because people haven't sent it in or they don't know how to classify it right. And when they don't classify it right, it defaults to gap 4, which means it like just doesn't count, which we want to fix. So is that helpful?
Thank you. Very.
Yeah.
Okay, are there any other questions for Jen?
I'm not seeing any in the chat. But certainly if somebody thinks of something, you can add it.
Well, I will just add that, we think of land trusts as team 30 by 30. So thank you for all that you do. We really appreciate you. And do let me know how I can help us succeed anytime.
Thank you so much, Jen. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, so next up is Tasha Newman with Pacific Policy Group. And, many years ago, we did, actually not too many years ago, but we did a survey with membership and asking, what is the most important thing? And, policy, of course, was tops. So Tasha and her partner, Mark, have been just fabulous working with us. And right now, they're going to give you a nice update on the state legislature. Tasha.
Thank you very much, Kim. It's good to be here today with all of you. And I'm going to run through in a little bit more detail, basically the couple things that Jen mentioned. So today we're going to talk about the budget, the governor's May revised proposal in particular, and we're also going to talk about the natural resource bond proposals. If we were going to achieve 30 by 30 and our climate smart strategies, all of the things that the administration and the legislature wants us to do in the natural resources sector, then we're definitely going to need money. And so, Mark usually goes over the policy legislation, and he is not able to join us today. So I think we've got plenty of things to talk about just in these two issue areas. Before I get into those, though, I just want to give a brief overview of where we are in the legislative process so far. So, California has a 2-year legislative session. And right now we're about halfway through the first year of that 2-year session. And in terms of where we are on state budget and bills, right now, the governor has just released his May revised proposal, which is an updated budget to the one that he released in January, given where the state's revenues are right now. The legislature and the administration will negotiate over the next few weeks in terms of what the final budget package will look like, and they need to deliver that package to the governor by June 15th so that he can enact it and have it ready to go by July 1st. And even though our state has like a deadline to get a budget package completed, many of you are probably aware that budget negotiations tend to be ongoing. So we do this big budget package, and then a lot of some of the details get worked out after the big budget package gets signed. So we call it Budget Bill Junior, and other budget trailer bills will happen even after this budget is signed. And we might see some of that happening this year because our income taxes aren't due until October. And so the state really has a question mark as to how much revenue will actually be coming in. And there's even been speculation that there could be a special session this fall, depending how all of the financing shakes out. And on bills, on policy bills, right now, most bills are on the floor of their respective houses. And the deadline to get bills off the floor is June 2nd. And then the bills move over into the second house where we start policy committees over, and the policy committees need to conclude by July 14th, at which point the legislature takes a 1-month recess. And then they come back and they have about 1 month to conclude all of the rest of the legislative business. Then they'll go on break until the following January. So just wanted to give you guys an idea of where we are in the legislative process. And then talk a little bit about the May revise budget proposal. So where we ended up at May revise was with a budget deficit of approximately 31.5 billion. Now, this is definitely more than what was what we were preparing for in January, which I think was about 24 billion. So this is a definite increase. And we've heard that, you know, it could get worse, but this is what we're dealing with at this point in time. And so the governor's plan to balance the budget is through a mix of funding delays, pullbacks, and fund shifts. As far as I know, reserves have not been tapped into yet, and we have a pretty robust reserve at this point. In terms of where the climate, natural resources funding ended up, there were 1.1 billion in proposed shifts to a potential bond. And the items that were proposed to be shifted are listed here, and they include water recycling, salton sea, community resilience centers, urban greening, state parks, you know, just a mix of different things that the governor had decided to shift over into a bond. And as Jen said, we haven't seen the governor's bond proposal yet. We're all very excited to see what he has in store. The legislature, you know, has their proposals, and so we'll just see where, if they are similar or what we're dealing with once the governor releases his. But as mentioned, I think natural resources fared pretty well. Not a lot of additional cuts from the January budget proposal, where, you know, Wildlife Conservation Board retained most of their general fund appropriations for implementation of 30 by 30 and things like that. Coastal Conservancy got a pretty significant cut in January, but no additional cuts were made in the May revised proposal. So that is something that Coastal Conservancy and others are, you know, happy to see, because we just didn't know where it was going to land. There were no additional cuts to our little, you know, capacity program at Department of Conservation, which we had heard might happen. And since there's so little of that money, we're really happy to see that appropriation stay there. And CCLT just applied for a $2 million block grant from that program. So we're very hopeful that CCLT will be successful in getting that grant award. And then again, just to remind everybody that, you know, Pacific Policy Group and CCLT, we are continuing to advocate with the legislature and the administration that we would like to maintain the original funding numbers for natural resources, given all that has to happen to achieve the goals of 30 by 30 and our, you know, climate smart solutions. And so, you know, even though it's a long shot, we are still pushing to try and get some more funding restored. And we've made some progress with legislators, at least with the Coastal Conservancy funding, because the governor's January budget came out before all of the storms. And so now there's a big push from the coastal legislators that, you know, look at since the budget was released, all of this damage occurred. And it just goes to show that we need more investment, not less investment in coastal protection. So gonna stop there on budget and switch over to bonds, because, you know, as a result of some of these proposed budget shifts, is, you know, what the governor wants to call it, we are seeing that the governor is supportive for a natural resources and climate resilience bond. And, you know, early on in the legislative session, 2 bond proposals were introduced, AB 1567 by Eduardo Garcia and SB 867 by Senator Allen. Both of these bonds are over $15 billion bonds, which are the largest natural resources bonds I've seen since I've been working in this sector. And so that was one of my questions to Jen, is if she knew how much the governor would be willing to support, because these are very sizable bonds. Of course, we could use every penny of them, but, you know, it does come down to what the, you know, governor and Department of Finance, what they're willing to get indebted over, and 15 plus billion is quite a substantial number. And as you can see here, the bonds are very similar, but they're not the same. So there's definitely going to be negotiations with the Senate and the Assembly over what a final package looks like. And also, once the governor releases his bond proposal, we'll really get to see the 3-way dynamic, and then negotiations will start to occur between leadership in both houses and the governor's office. And then, you know, we will see a final bill package. But as you can tell from that, there's a lot of funding being proposed for biodiversity, for, you know, that's our nature-based solutions money, lots of money for state conservancies. And so, you know, these would be very helpful bonds for the land trust community if, you know, one is passed and approved by the voters. So I just wanted to point out a few things that we need to keep in mind around the bonds. This year, there have been several bond proposals introduced in the legislature. So not only do we have the 2 natural resources bonds, we have an agriculture bond that's at about 3.5 billion. We have a couple flood bonds. We have 2 housing bonds, and I know that one of the housing bonds is like 25 billion in itself. The other one is 10 billion. And then, you know, also school bonds. So there's a lot of bonds out there. And I think that the governor also wants to do a mental health bond. So given all of that, there's going to be negotiations over which bonds get to move forward this year, how much those bonds are. We've heard rumors that the total for all the bonds together, whatever bonds go forward, is going to be around 25 billion. Now, I haven't ground truth that, so I'm not exactly sure if that's the number, but if that's the number, you could see that maybe a natural resources bond might have to come down a little bit. And maybe it won't be at that 15 billion mark. We'll just have to see what happens. Another thing to mention is that we're not sure of the timing for a natural resources bond. I know a lot of folks want to see a natural resources bond on the March primary ballot because it would be a less crowded ballot and maybe have a better chance of passing without all these other bonds you know, getting in the way of how voters might react to seeing that much debt being proposed. However, it's hard to get a bond through the legislature, and to get on the March ballot, you would have to have something completely done by September 14th. And so to get an entire, you know, get the governor's proposal, which we haven't even seen yet, and get the Senate and the Assembly, everyone to coordinate and agree on a package, that's a lot to get done between now and September. It could happen if the governor really puts his weight behind it. Otherwise, we're looking at November, which a much more crowded ballot. And also wanted to mention, if we take a bond to the ballot, land trust will definitely be asked to contribute money to a campaign. So this is something for the land trust community to start thinking about. Like, if a bond goes to the ballot, either March or November, there's going to be a campaign. And generally, you know, land trusts have been asked to put up money for those campaigns. And then last but not least, just wanted to mention that this money is not immediate. If it's passed in November 2024, the funds won't be available until sometime in 2025. That's why we're really trying to hold on to as much as this general fund money as we can, because that funding is available now. And you know, not only is a bond not a certainty, you know, a bond is just, it's never enough money. No matter if it's 15 billion or 4 billion, we can use all the money we can get. So CCLT, again, just wanted to mention, is involved in discussions and negotiations around what's included in, you know, any of the bond proposals that move forward. I do want to mention that we have been talking to legislators and agency folks about the need for long-term stewardship funding, as well as capacity funding for land trusts, to be able to get this money on the ground, to be able to do the work that we're doing to achieve 30 by 30 and you know, our climate smart land management strategies. And so these are not things that are typically funded by bonds, but it's something that we're going to continue to ask for. We're not sure if there might be some way to get a little something in there, but we're going to continue to work with the legislature and the administration on this point, because we think it's very important to the land trust community and to others. And that is my presentation. Does anyone have any questions? And does anyone know where this picture is? That's my question to you.
Somebody said Fair Oaks, or Kelly said Fair Oaks in the chat.
That is it.
Yep.
That's my backyard. Not literally, but it's the old Fair Oaks Bridge.
Tasha, I had a quick question. You had mentioned that the bonds were totaling 25 billion, all bonds, but then you had said that the housing bonds could be 25 billion plus 10 billion. Are you, so I was trying to square that up. Are you saying that the tolerance for the voters in any given election is about 25 billion, or
what we've heard is that might be like the tolerance for the Department of Finance, you know, the allowable amount that, you know, bond indebtedness that could be approved. Now, again, I've heard that. I'm not positive about that number, and there's speculation going around about that. So I just wanted to mention there will be a ceiling though. So we're not going to get a $25 billion housing bond and a 15 billion natural resources bond and a 10 billion education bond. Like, there will be like a limit to how much the governor will let go through. And so I just want to mention that, because all of these bonds are pretty big in size.
Yeah.
And, you know, just for expectation management, we haven't gotten feedback from the governor's office yet on what they would be willing to approve for a natural resources bond.
Got it. Thanks.
Okay, are there any other questions for Tasha?
Looks like Kelly raised her hand.
Yeah, so as far as the contribution from members, land trusts, is that like a per bond, and are we talking a couple $100, or can you give us an idea of what that?
Well, it would just, well, generally it would be for the natural resources bond. And for campaign, to put together a campaign, I'm just gonna throw out what, you know, a campaign might cost. And it will be more if it's in November, I believe, than if it's in March. But we're thinking a campaign could be around $10 million. So we're asking, I'm sure that the ask will be for in the thousands. Going towards, you know, helping to get this measure passed.
Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions for Tasha? All right, well, Tasha, thank you so much, as always, for updating everyone. That's a lot of information. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Happy to answer any questions anytime.
And
Great.
Kim, I had put in the chat, or I think Suzanne had asked if we would share the PowerPoint. So Tasha, if you could make sure to send that to us, if you're good with us sharing it, and we'll send it out to everybody
Totally.
after the meeting. Yeah, thanks.
Great. Okay, so the last presentation that we have for you this afternoon is with Amy Lindholm and Graham Chisholm with the Land and Water Conservation Fund. We really appreciate you guys coming on to share your information with us on this one. So Amy and Graham, it's all yours.
Thank you, Kim. I appreciate what Tasha was saying about, you know, if we're going to get to 30 by 30, we're going to need money. So we're here to talk about the federal side of that money, getting the feds to pony up to match all of the resources that you all are putting in at the state level in California. So Kayla, I think, is going to share her screen for me with the slides. Thank you. So thank you all so much for giving us the opportunity to talk with you today. Some of you may have been at the Land Trust Alliance rally last September for the session that we did on unleashing a permanently funded land and water conservation fund for climate and equity, which we've updated here with some new developments and opportunities, and zeroed in on California, which is really both the national leader when it comes to conservation and climate, and also the historic epicenter of LWCF investment, far and away the largest recipient of any state of LWCF funding by a factor of 4. So this is not a coincidence, I'm sure. Can you go to the next slide, Kim? So my name is Amy Lindholm with the Appalachian Mountain Club, but I help coordinate the National Land and Water Conservation Fund Coalition. So I'm going to do a brief introduction here and talk about the current state of play with LWCF, and then you'll hear from my colleague, Graham Chisholm, who coordinates LWCF coalition partners in California, to hear more about specific examples in different landscapes across the state. And we'll talk a little bit about new grant opportunities available this year. So these are real world examples of LWCF at work on the front lines of conservation, directly targeting those interrelated goals of climate mitigation and resilience, and increasing access to nature's benefits for underserved, historically marginalized, and environmental justice communities. And then I'll bring it back full circle to talk about the ways that we can continue to work together for the common success of these funding sources, and the work that the funds empower by land trusts like you guys across California and across the country. Next slide. So the LWCF Coalition brings together land trust partners with many other diverse stakeholders, from land protection to recreation to business and community stakeholders, to really show members of Congress and the administration in Washington how much support there is for conservation and recreation access projects across the country, what a huge asset they are to communities, so that it's not just land trusts advocating for their own projects, but it's the whole community advocating for the projects that they benefit from. But you guys are doing the work on the ground, so your voices really matter. And it took more than 10 years of sustained effort, but connecting local voices like yours to national decision makers is really what drove our success in passing the Great American Outdoors Act, which was one of the biggest national victories for conservation in decades. Next slide. So, I want to thank you all again for your partnership over the years that has contributed to that big win. It happened in the midst of COVID, so we haven't had as much opportunity to celebrate that victory in passing this historic legislation in August of 2020, which finally guaranteed permanent dedicated funding of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. But it's great to have the opportunity to be with you all today to say, hey, we did it. We did it together after more than half a century of those funds being diverted to other purposes away from conservation, more than half every year. And that will never happen again. So we succeeded, and we did it in a big bipartisan way that has left a legacy of real continued engagement and goodwill in Congress long after the actual votes. They were lopsided votes in an incredibly polarized political environment, which is extremely effective, like top line message that conservation is something that brings people together. And it's a testament to all the work that local partners like you all have done with our coalition over the years. Next slide. So what does that mean that we've passed permanent dedicated funding? It means $900 million annually is guaranteed for LWCF consistently every year permanently. And what does it mean for land trusts? It means more opportunity. I think most of you are likely familiar with LWCF as the most important source of federal funding for conservation. It may be overshadowed at times by the kind of really ample resources that you all have in California to bring to bear at the state level. You guys are throwing around all these multi-billion-dollar figures. But still, California has received more LWCF money than any other state, 4 times as much, as critical federal match and complement to those state funds. So we at the coalition and so many partners in California have worked together for decades to realize the full potential of this program because it has incredible strength and flexibility. So this slide shows the map that the coalition put together a few years ago with the Trust for Public Land. And finally, for the first time, shows the true scope of LWCF investments across the country. And this is actually before passing the Great American Outdoors Act. So if you have a chance to check this out, if you zoom in on California, it'll really blow your mind. I love, for example, drilling down on the Bay Area, and you see like a purple dot for a place like Golden Gate NRA or Point Reyes National Seashore, Muir Woods. And then as you get closer, they explode into multiple dots that show each individual LWCF project investment. And those purple dots are joined by all the purple ones are Park Service projects, blue ones for stateside projects, and so many others. And they just kind of really cover the map, which is great. Next slide. So what that map really shows that you might not realize is that LWCF actually has 10 different sub-programs. It's a big, broad toolbox that empowers this array of different types of projects, from federal agency priorities within those national parks, national forests, wildlife refuges, trail corridors, et cetera, to expanding and improving called to home recreation opportunities at state and local parks, greenways, playgrounds, et cetera, through the stateside program and the newest grants called the Outdoor Recreation Legacy Partnership, or ORLP grants, specifically prioritizing investment in urban underserved communities, to a variety of other state and local grants that protect drinking water, keep forests as forests, support sustainable timber operations, build climate resilience, habitat connectivity, carbon storage, things like the Forest Legacy Program, Cooperative Endangered Species Conservation Fund Program, or Section 6, and others. So you can find detailed information on all of the different subprograms and the types of grants and how to access funds for whatever project you might have in mind by looking at our project toolkit on the LWCF Coalition website. And I'll put up the URL for that in a little bit. Next slide. So passing the Great American Outdoors Act was this really big accomplishment that benefits us all tremendously, because all of these tools will be consistently funded now year after year. So that allows for this level of planning and big picture thinking that just wasn't possible before, when funding fluctuated anywhere between 250 million to 500 million a year for the whole country. So now 900 million is this solid floor for us to stand on, and it's a floor, not a ceiling. So while there's still very real challenges as we seek to accelerate the pace of conservation and reach into previously underserved places, there's no doubt that stable, consistent funding allows for that bigger vision and deliberate efforts to broaden the benefits of conservation and recreation to more communities. Next slide. I think you guys are all familiar with 30 by 30 in America the Beautiful. Climate and equity are clearly the biggest challenges that we face, and they've been fused by the Biden administration, and I think by your administration in California as well, as they should be. So science tells us that land is our most important asset in fighting climate change. Protecting natural areas and natural infrastructure is really paramount for building resilience into communities, as well as mitigating. So at the same time, ensuring equity is centered in this work is equally paramount. And those most in need of increased access to nature in underserved and environmental justice communities are the same areas and populations that are experiencing greater burdens of pollution, warming, and extreme weather. I know you all are facing some incredibly difficult challenges in California, from fire to flooding to massive development pressure and income inequality, but you're also clearly at the forefront of awareness and innovation and investment, and have a lot of really critical engagement from the state administration that you can bring to bear, and we want to be able to match that on the federal side. Luckily, LWCF is well placed to help tackle these challenges, as you can see from the examples of work being done on the ground, which Graham will talk about. The key principles outlined in the America the Beautiful report, and I think also in the state 30 by 30 reports, share a lot of common ground with the elements that drive LWCF's success: flexibility, inclusion, public-private collaboration, and empowerment, especially of locally driven conservation with input from all stakeholders. So with that, I'll turn to Graham to show us some examples of what it looks like to execute on this vision using the LWCF toolbox in California.
Great, go ahead and go to the next slide. So hello, many friends and also conservation champions who've been doing great work all around the state. I think the land trust community really is so well represented here in California. It's very exciting to see the work that has been done. So as Amy pointed out, California has been a huge beneficiary of LWCF funding. Probably the only category where we don't lead is in funding for Civil War battlefields, and that's probably thankfully. But nonetheless, over the years, LWCF has invested more than $2.5 billion here in California. And it's, as Amy's pointed out, a whole variety of funding. In the president's budget for the coming year, so FY24, I'll just highlight a few of the investments that are being proposed. 10.5 billion to the BLM for the North Coast. That's to help support the partnership work that they're doing with Save the Redwoods. 10 million to the Forest Service for the San Bernardino National Forest for inholding buyout. 7.3 million to the BLM for the Mojave Foothills work, and I'll mention Mojave Desert Land Trust in just a bit. So really key to these investments is the support by our congressional delegation. So California has 52 members of the House of Representatives, by far the largest of any state, and we have about 44 who I will call solid supporters or even champions of LWCF. There are also a handful of other members who we'd like to bring on board by highlighting the benefits of LWCF and their districts. And I would say that that's a role that you are really potentially at the forefront for, because there are a number of members, particularly we'll call them either swing districts, we'll call them often moderate Republicans who, we believe when push comes to shove, we'll support LWCF, but often, as you know, Western Republicans have tended not to always support land acquisition. But I think key, and we believe key to this, is really ensuring that we come out with a bipartisan message, that we look to leveraging your partners, potentially board members, community members, people on your local Chamber of Commerce's, who might be able to reach some of these members to highlight the benefits that public lands, public land access, public land recreation provide in their communities. So I'd be happy to talk with any of you about opportunities here in California. We certainly can highlight the members that we think are reachable. And I would say even those members who, in the past have been quite opposed to public land acquisition, it never hurts to continue to keep knocking on the door so that they know that there are members in their districts who care about this. Next slide, please. So I'll just highlight some of the examples. So Mojave Desert Land Trust is probably the highest volume LWCF by acquisition of any land trust in the nation. They continue to work with BLM, National Park Service, on in-holding acquisition, and it just, I think, really helps the public agencies to know that there's a local partner there prepared to help them year in, year out. Another long-term example is the work that Dave Sutton and the Trust for Public Land have been doing as part of this Northern Sierra Partnership to continue to buy out the checkerboards of private lands along the I-80 corridor and bringing those lands into public management. Another one that I'll highlight is the Pacific Crest Trail Association has been really successful at chipping away at their acquisition priorities to help complete and enhance the trail corridor. And they, in particular, are great ambassadors to House representatives on both sides of the aisle. Go ahead and next slide, please. So Section 6 is one of the programs that was mentioned, and Section 6, funded through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, makes annual investments in conservation through planning grants, acquisition grants, and grants to help HCPs. To date, California has received 40% of all Section 6 funding, and it really reflects our state's commitment to conservation. So there are many grants here in California that have been made over the years, and probably be too long to list them all. But just as examples, in Santa Barbara County, 3.6 million went to support an acquisition of a conservation easement on 566 acres in the Purisima Hills to protect tiger salamanders. Western Riverside County Multi-Species Habitat Conservation Plan has been a really long-term recipient of these monies. They recently received 4.4 million to acquire 737 acres. If you're interested in trying to access these monies, I'd really encourage you to both explore CDFW's website, but also really talk to your regional CDFW representatives to look at development proposal to see how you can shape a proposal to try to fit the criteria. Next slide, please. Probably one area where California, hasn't had a lot of projects, though we've had over $26 million invested here, is the Forest Legacy Program. And it assists state and private forest landowners to maintain working forests through a 75-25% match to make grants for permanent conservation easements or fee acquisition. In this case, CAL FIRE is the key contact for developing a proposal. And a good place to start is to review the page on CAL FIRE's website that also includes an assessment of needs that they've developed. as well as this California State Forest Action Plan, and that'll show you how your priorities align with what CAL FIRE is prioritizing. While we haven't seen a lot of these projects in California, CAL FIRE is interested in stepping up the number of proposed projects. We'll highlight in a minute that the Federal Inflation Reduction Act included a special $700 million fund allocation to the Forest Legacy Program that we'll talk about in just a minute. Next slide. And highlighting the theme of equity, in 2014, Congress established a new program, which is called the Outdoor Recreation Legacy Partnership, ORLP, which delivers nationally competitive grants that fund urban areas with jurisdictions of more than 50,000 people, with a priority being given to projects located in economically disadvantaged areas and lacking outdoor opportunities. Over $45 million has gone out in ORLP grants. And in California, to date, we've received just over half of that amount. Nonprofit partners can collaborate with state and municipalities to identify community needs and develop a strong grant application and help secure matching funds that can be used to leverage these dollars. Next slide, please. Obviously, the work that Jen Norris and people at CNRA are leading through the 30 by 30 that work is well underway. We really believe that LWCF is critical both to matching the 30 by 30 work here, as well as enhancing the state investments that are being made by Wildlife Conservation Board, CNRA, the Conservancies, and so many other agencies. Next slide, please. Amy and I wanted to highlight 3 areas that there's special funding allocations that have been set up and that are available at this point. One, as I mentioned, the Forest Legacy Program has a special $700 million fund to step up the number of projects and acres under this program. Most of these projects thus far in California have been up in the North Coast. But I would urge you, if you're working in California's forest lands, to really dig into CAL FIRE's website, look at the needs assessment, the action plan, and then reach out to the CAL FIRE team to explore the potential of developing a project. Finally, second, I would say National Park Service is trying to step up its pace of the ORLP program by tweaking some of the criteria and overcoming some of the challenges applicants have had to earlier rounds of funding. I will also highlight that Senator Padilla and House member Nancy Barragan from the LA area are also trying to legislatively authorize this program with an Outdoors for All legislation, both in the Senate and the House. And so they've been real champions on this. There have been, I'll say, some concerns that this program has, as initially implemented, made it difficult to pursue the funding. But the Park Service has really been committed to working with partners to try to tweak those criteria. And, we look forward to California continuing to lead in terms of applications and successful applications in this area. Finally, DOD's REPI program, which is the Readiness and Environmental Protection Integration Program, is set up to leverage a special $80 million LWCF fund that's going to be allocated through the National Park Service's stateside program, and in California through the State Parks Local Assistance Office. So again, if you're working around Department of Defense facilities, if you don't know about the REPI program, I suggest you look it up and learn about it, but I think there's opportunities to leverage some additional funding here. But in every case, I think California Land Trust, communities, and agencies are super well placed to compete for these funds. I know Amy's going to conclude for us here, but I remain available as a kind of a a resource here in California, as long as I'm working for the coalition, to really help you think through the potential to pursue LWCF projects or to highlight LWCF work here in California and to help you get out the word to members of Congress. So my email is at the end. We'll share these slides with everyone, but please feel free to reach out. Back to you, Amy.
Thanks, Graham. I'll just stay on this slide for a second and I'll say, I think a lot of these new opportunities represent areas where we at the LWCF Coalition and partners have really worked in partnership with the administration and with Congress to look at the program after passing GAOA, see where some of the roadblocks are, see where some of the opportunities are, and innovate. And we appreciate the administration's desire to be flexible and innovate in that way. Some of the ORLP roadblocks were like that 50,000 person threshold for jurisdictions. Some highly urbanized areas, nevertheless are smaller. There's no direct access for tribes, which we're working on with those members in California through the Outdoors for All Act to change that. We saw an opportunity as Congress was really debating climate legislation through Build Back Better and then what became the Inflation Reduction Act. And we worked hard to get natural climate solutions into that bill to say, look, clean energy is really important, but climate is also about land. Got that extra money for forest conservation. And we've been talking to the administration about unobligated LWCF state grant funds that are still sitting in the agency. And they came up with this idea to partner with DOD through the REPI program to direct more funds into, REPI's been really successful at doing conservation and recreation access projects around all kinds of DOD facilities and military installations. So it proves that when we work together and we're talking with the administration and with champs in Congress, that we can really fill some gaps and get some more things done. So next slide, Kim. So, as you've kind of seen demonstrated here, we know LWCF is this really important suite of tools to execute on America the Beautiful and California's vision for 30 by 30. And it's great to see the administration thinking creatively about how to leverage these tools. But we also know that ultimately it's not going to be enough to get to 30 by 30 or even just to meet the needs of our current population at this level. The vision has to look beyond LWCF's originally promised 900 million floor. That level was set to meet the annual need for the American population in 1978. So to even meet the same level of need with 100 million more Americans now today, with today's dollars, it would require closer to $3.6 billion annually. And that's before you even think about climate and the crisis that we're now facing. But the projects are really out there, ready to go. The program is still hugely oversubscribed, even now with $900 million annually. The president's budget lists an additional $200 million of federal agency and forest legacy projects beyond what can be funded with the $900 million total this year, including Graham mentioned the Mojave Desert Foothills Project. There's one at Golden Gate NRA, San Bernardino, and Cleveland National Forests that are all on the supplemental list for FY24. So if we can succeed in getting more money, they could get funded. There's also, there's 6 or 9 projects for California on the core list that definitely will get funded this year, but this is the continued need that's out there. And we know some of the projects on the list are only pieces of a bigger vision that stands ready to go with willing seller landowners. So there's a project at Don Edwards National Wildlife Refuge in Newark, California, for example, on the list for FY24 that will get funded. And that's a parcel threatened by development, very necessary for adapting to sea level rise. What's listed in the president's budget on that core list represents only half the funding. So it's actually likely they break these projects up into phases. It's actually likely to take 3 fiscal years to cover the entire federal contribution from LWCF for that project, which is 16 million. Because the agencies are trying to spread these dollars across the entire country. Similarly, there's huge opportunity this year, as Suzanne chimed in on the chat, up in the Redwoods, Lost Coast, where they might actually get the entire project need, 25 million, I think, on the federal side in 2 fiscal years. But there's tens of thousands of acres of privately owned timberland remaining in that redwood landscape. It looks like TPL and a couple other partners are looking at big forest legacy projects, particularly maybe tapping into that extra forest legacy money, which is great. And there's others working there, but so much more remains to be done. And this is the case not just in California, obviously, but landscape level investments in other states are available. I know of several, like around $40 million and one up to $100 million with a single landowner in other parts of the country. So we are pushing hard to make the policy changes that are needed to get these dollars on the ground, but also to push for increased investment, because the biggest roadblock, even after the Great American Outdoors Act, is still funding, as you see with the challenges at the state level and the budget as well. So luckily, as I mentioned earlier, the campaign for permanent funding left a lot of good feelings and a big head of steam in Congress. It was a really feel-good bill on both sides of the aisle. And LWCF continues to enjoy broad bipartisan support, thanks to engagement from partners like you all. And so that's more vital than ever with polarization kind of increasing. We really have to continue to make the case for conservation as the common ground that everybody can agree on across the political spectrum as smart policy for climate, for public health, for equity. And at the same time, it builds and diversifies rural economies and feeds this $55 billion recreation industry that you all have in California. So I think there'll be more opportunities to expand this funding. We have been laying the groundwork for that. It's been really important to see where we are after passing GAOA, how far that money has gone and what the gaps still are, but now we're there and making the case for more. And there opportunities come up like IRA to expand that investment. So we hope that'll only be the beginning. Next slide. In the annual appropriations process, we are pushing for an additional $450 million to cover those projects on the supplemental list for the current fiscal year, above and beyond the $900 million provided under the Great American Outdoors Act. So we rely on folks like you, like Suzanne came to one of our fly-ins and made the case to members of Congress, like, here's the work on the ground, here's the continuing unmet need, here's why you need to invest more, even though we just passed this great big bill, it's not over. So we still need your help more than ever. And I would love to have all of you engage with the coalition. If you're not doing so already, I know some of you, others I don't. And, you know, great to have you engage through Graham. But our job is to really showcase your work, both the completed efforts that are successful and those continuing unmet needs. And, you know, connect you with voices that are not doing the work, but want to support your work by advocating at the national level. So hopefully together we can continue to build on the success. Thanks. We have contact information, I think, on that last slide, Kayla, for both me and Graham, which we can share with everybody.
Great. Amy, Graham, thank you so very much. This was very informative. We really appreciate it. Now, does anyone have any questions?
I'll just ask briefly. Amy, do you want me to bring up that last slide, or is it okay? You'll just put it in the chat.
Put it in the chat. That's totally fine. Thank you.
Hi, Graham.
We can follow up with it too. Sorry, go ahead, Michael.
Hi, Graham. It's Michael Delbar, California Rangeland Trust. Great information on the program. A lot of information there, a lot of comments about governmental land acquisitions and some pretty large scale acquisitions, and trying to win over some of those Western US Congress members on the Republican side with such large fee acquisitions by governments probably makes it more of a challenge. But what I didn't hear in the presentation were comments about the working land conservation. And that's a critical part of reaching these goals. But as we know, working land easements funded through LWCF have to be held by government. And that's a big challenge for landowners. So now that we've reauthorized and fully appropriated LWCF, is the coalition now going to get behind an effort to allow qualified third parties to hold easements on these working lands that are funded through LWCF dollars?
Yeah, I think, we believe, we totally agree that working lands are a critical part of getting to 30 by 30, and a lot of easement work that LWCF does through Forest Legacy and through the Fish and Wildlife Service with a lot of ranchers is really great work. And I understand that it can be a stumbling block for certain landowners to have the federal folks having title or state level folks having title. But those programs are still totally oversubscribed. And I'll say, our top priority as a coalition has been to protect the program's mission by trying to improve implementation and fill gaps without opening up the underlying authorizing legislation. So that's a strategic position that has nothing to do with the merits of the proposal. The victory that we had with the Great American Outdoors Act, you had Senate Leader McConnell at the time, House Speaker Pelosi at the time, with the minority leaders who are now both majority leaders since they're both flipped, and then President Trump, all lining up for this bill in a type of alignment and the dynamics driving it that were the product of this moment in time that I don't think will be replicated in a generation. So we don't want to open that up and unravel what we've achieved. But we do think that there are ways to increase working lands protection through complementary and parallel programs to LWCF that can allow LWCF to work with the landowners that want to work with it, and then create some others. We've been working with a lot of partners on the proposed Forest Conservation Easement Program, FSEP, which would do, I think, great work alongside ASEP to increase private lands conservation in a way that can work complementary to LWCF without risking opening up the underlying legislation for LWCF itself.
Well, one of the challenges, go ahead, Graham. I'm sorry.
Just real quick, both those programs that Amy mentioned are through the Department of Agriculture and through the Farm Bill. So that's obviously been such a great source of working lands monies as well that have gone into conservation through NRCS. Sorry, Michael, go ahead.
Well, in regard to Forest Legacy, my understanding is CAL FIRE doesn't have the human resource capacity to process those applications at this point. They're not interested in that. They like to see the lands conserved, but they're not interested in holding easements. So a qualified third party on the Forest Legacy side would go a long way to getting those lands conserved and remaining in private ownership. And so that's a change that could be done to Forest Legacy. It's a pretty simple one, and would, even if FSEP doesn't succeed, and frankly, finding a brand new $100 million allocation for that's going to be a big challenge. So, why not fix a program that's working now and improve it through qualified third parties on Forest Legacy?
Unfortunately, I have to say that it's a simple change on paper, but it's not a simple change in the House of Representatives. It's just not.
Why is that? Because I just came back from there last week or 2 weeks ago, and all the members with whom we visited, nobody had any opposition to that. So why is that not an easy fix?
Because there's a lot of members who would love to see a new debate over LWCF and federal land acquisition, and we'll take that opportunity. And we fought that fight for a solid decade, and most of the champions in Congress who fought that fight just don't have the appetite to fight it again.
Well,
so it's a strategic thing that just has to do with national politics, unfortunately.
Well, I think I got my answer, Amy, but thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I know it's a challenge. It's one that we want to continue to work with you on.
Well, we heard, with all due respect, we don't want to open it up until we get it reauthorized. But once we get it reauthorized, then we'll approach the third party. Then we got that same line until we get it appropriated. We got it appropriated. Now we're still getting the same line. So at some point we need to make some improvements to it. But
Honestly, Michael, it's a consistent line. It wasn't until we get it.
line.
It was just, we can't do that. I mean, we've just seen where that path leads and it's not a good place.
Well, we can agree to disagree on that one, but thank you for the information.
Thanks. Other questions?
No? Helen, no other questions popping up or anything in the chat that we need to respond to?
I didn't see anything in the chat. A lot of good comments in there, but I don't see any questions.
So I went ahead and put our contact information in the chat, but we'll also work with CCLT to circulate the slides, and the last slide will have our contacts there. And again, happy to both have a conversation ongoing about LWCF and potential projects, potential improvements and otherwise. And, truly you are the closest friends we have here in California, and really deeply appreciate the work you do. And we want to be able to enhance your work. So thank you.
Great. Well, Amy Graham, thank you so much. And thanks also to Tasha and Jen for fabulous presentations today. And to our members, if you guys had responded to a recent survey that helped inform our block grant proposal, we are grateful. Thank you so very much for all that you've done to help us help you. So with that, I think we're done. Please stay tuned, and we will be hosting another one of these meetings in a few months, and hope to see you then. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank
Thank
you
you so
all.
much.
It's great information.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Bye.
Thank you. Hi, Kim. Stay on for a second, or are you signing off?
Oh, sure. No,